She was 19 years old, and she had been chosen, not fallen in love with, chosen. In the careful, unsentimental arithmetic of the House of Windsor, the future king needed a bride, and that bride had to satisfy a checklist the public was never meant to see: young, Protestant, aristocratic, unscandalous, and the word that was actually used, suitable. Lady Diana Spencer ticked every box, and the two women who made sure of it were not strangers to each other. They were best friends. One was the Queen Mother. The other was Ruth, Lady Fermoy, the Queen Mother's lifelong companion and lady-in-waiting, and as it happened, Diana's own grandmother. Between them, these two old women in their twinset world of duty and discretion guided a teenage girl toward a marriage with a man who loved someone else, into a family that needed an heir more than it needed her happiness. Diana thought she was marrying a prince. The institution knew it was acquiring a brood mare, and when she turned out to have a heart, a will, and a voice of her own, the same machine that had chosen her so carefully set about destroying her. She was never the princess of the fairy tale. She was the sacrificial lamb, and the people who led her to the altar knew it. The record asks us to slow down on one part of that. The phrase sacrificial lamb did not start with a documentary or a tabloid. It started with Diana. In the tapes she made for Andrew Morton in 1992, the foundation of the book that detonated her marriage, she described her own selection in exactly those terms. Charles, she said, had found the virgin, the sacrificial lamb. That is the woman herself, describing what was done to her, in her own words. And the deeper you go into how she was chosen, the harder it becomes to call her wrong. Begin with the checklist, because the checklist is the whole story. By 1980, the Prince of Wales was nearly 32 and unmarried, and the pressure on him to settle the succession had become a low, constant hum inside the institution. But the man could not simply marry whom he liked. The conventions that governed a future king's bride in 1980 were, in practice, the conventions of a century earlier. The biographer Wendy Holden has laid them out plainly. She had to be young so that she could bear a great many children. She had to be Protestant, she had to be a front-rank aristocrat, and she had to be a virgin. Untouched, undefiled, unscandalous, those were the operative words, and they were applied to a human being the way you might apply specifications to a commission. The pool of women who satisfied all of it, in Britain at that moment, was vanishingly small. That is not romance, that is procurement. And here is what the official record leaves out of the fairy tale. Lady Diana Spencer did not merely happen to wander into Charles's life. She was, in a word that one biographer uses without flinching, star-spotted. The Queen Mother, Wendy Holden writes, identified Diana as the girl. The machinery that turned an identification into an arrangement involved members of the household, Charles's own valet among them. But the identification itself, the moment a teenage girl was looked at and assessed and quietly marked as suitable, that came from the top of the family's oldest generation. Diana was 19. She had no idea she was being measured. To understand how she was measured, you have to understand the two women doing the measuring and the world they came from. This is the part the photographs could never show. Ruth, Lady Fermoy, was born in October 1908. By the time Diana was a teenager, Ruth had spent decades at the absolute center of the Queen Mother's private circle. She had been appointed an extra woman of the bedchamber in 1956, promoted to woman of the bedchamber in 1960, and she would hold that post for 33 years, until her death. A woman of the bedchamber is not a ceremonial title pinned on for show. It is proximity. It is the person who is simply there, in the room, on the train, at the lunch, across half a lifetime. The Queen Mother and Lady Fermoy were not acquaintances who shared a few engagements. They were lifelong friends, two women who had grown old inside the same set of certainties about blood and duty and what a great family was owed. And Ruth Fermoy was also, by an accident of genealogy that the institution found very convenient, Diana's grandmother. Diana's mother, Frances, was Ruth's daughter. So when people say the marriage was arranged between the two grandmothers, they are pointing at something real. Two best friends, occupying the most intimate possible position inside the royal household, with a granddaughter who happened to satisfy every line of the checklist. It is the kind of coincidence that, in this world, was never really a coincidence at all. The class machinery that produced Diana, Burke's peerage, the Wright schools, the Sandringham estate where the Spencers lived as tenants of the crown, was the same machinery the older generation trusted to deliver the right sort of girl. The girl was right there. It is worth sitting for a moment inside the world these two women inhabited, because that world is what made the selection possible. It was a world of twinsets and pearls in country houses, of letters written by hand, and conversations conducted in a kind of code where the most consequential things were said most quietly. Duty was not a slogan in that world. It was the air. A great family was understood to be owed certain things: continuity, an heir, a bloodline carried forward without scandal, and the women of that family understood it as their particular work to see those things delivered. The Queen Mother had married into the House of Windsor in 1923 and spent the rest of her long life as one of its principal architects, the soft surface over the working machine. Lady Fermoy had spent 3 decades inside that same architecture, close enough to the center to know exactly how it functioned. These were not naive women. They had watched the institution take its price from people before. They knew, better than almost anyone alive, what a young woman was signing for when she married into the firm, and they knew it because they had lived it. That knowledge is precisely what makes the selection of a 19-year-old so cold to look at now. Whatever else they did or did not arrange, the older generation understood the terms. Diana did not. She was a teenager who had grown up admiring the institution from the outside. The women who looked at her and saw a suitable bride had grown up inside it, and they had no illusions left at all. But the people who were actually in the room remembered it differently, and this is where the record demands honesty. The popular version says the two grandmothers engineered the match together, quietly, deliberately, hand in glove. The documentary trail is more complicated than that, and the script of Diana's life will not survive a careful reading if we pretend otherwise. The Queen Mother's promotional role, the star spotting, the approval, is the firmer half of the story, attested by biographers and broadly accepted. Lady Fermoy's role is the contested half, because Ruth Fermoy, asked directly whether she and the Queen Mother had engineered the marriage of their grandchildren, did not bask in the credit. She denied it. Her words, as they have come down to us: "You can say that if you like, but it simply wouldn't be true." And there is more, and it cuts the other way entirely. Lady Fermoy is reported, by family and biographers, to have warned Diana off the marriage before it happened. The line attributed to her is gentle and devastating at once. "Darling, you must understand that their sense of humor and their lifestyle are different, and I don't think it will suit you." Some accounts cast her as very nearly the only voice of doubt in a chorus of national excitement, so we are left with two grandmothers in two very different postures: the Queen Mother, who saw the girl and approved her, and Lady Fermoy, who said it would not suit her and then watched her go anyway. The brief's frame, two old women who knowingly led a lamb to the altar, is the version the audience carries, and it is built on something true: the friendship, the proximity, the checklist. But the narrower, documented truth is that one of those women said on the record that she had warned the girl. Hold both. The institution selected Diana. Whether everyone who loved her wanted the selection is a quieter, sadder question. What is not in dispute is the man she was being selected for, and what he brought to the marriage. The truth was quieter and colder than any wedding broadcast. Charles and Diana had first met in November 1977, when Diana was 16 and the prince was, briefly, in the orbit of her elder sister. The romance that mattered did not begin until the summer of 1980, when Diana was newly 19. By the autumn, she had been brought to Balmoral and assessed by the family in their own setting, and she had passed. The engagement was announced on the 24th of February, 1981, and it is on that very day, in front of the cameras, that the whole arithmetic of the marriage showed itself for anyone willing to see it. They were asked if they were in love. Diana, 19, said of course they were. She would later call it a thick question, the obvious thing anyone would say. And then Charles, beside her, added 5 words that have outlived almost everything else he has ever said in public, whatever in love means. Diana said later that the answer threw her completely, that it traumatized her. Read it coldly, and it is not cruelty so much as candor. The prince was telling the truth. He was not in love, or not in the way the broadcast required, and he was not going to pretend on camera that he was. Because there was a third presence in the arrangement already, a woman the prince had known and loved for years, and her name was Camilla. The institution did not need Charles to love Diana. It needed an heir, and it needed a suitable mother for that heir. And on both counts, Diana qualified. Love was never in the specification. So the wedding, when it came on the 29th of July, 1981 at St. Paul's Cathedral, was a spectacle of staggering scale built on a foundation everyone close to it already knew was hollow. St. Paul's was chosen over the Abbey for the simple reason that it sat more people and allowed a longer procession through the streets, more pageant, more crowd, more spectacle. Around 750 million people watched. 3,500 guests filled the cathedral. And somewhere in that congregation sat Camilla, then the wife of one of the invited guests. Diana had turned 20 just weeks before. She walked up that aisle as the most photographed woman alive, and she had been chosen, at 19, for a job. And the job had a vacancy in the heart of it that she could already feel. This is the arithmetic the channel's audience has learned to recognize because it runs underneath so much of this family's history. The substitution of function for affection, dressed up as fairy tale. Think about what the institution actually required of the bride it had specified. It required her youth, because youth meant years of childbearing ahead. It required her bloodline, because the heirs had to be unimpeachably aristocratic. It required her blamelessness, because the public could not be given a scandal. And it required, above all, her compliance, the assumption, baked into every line of the checklist, that a girl chosen for these qualities would also possess the one quality the specification never wrote down, which was the willingness to be exactly what she was told to be, and nothing more. The marriage was, in this reading, a transaction conducted in the language of romance. The cathedral, the dress, the 750 million viewers, the carriage through the streets, all of it was the public face of an arrangement whose private terms had been settled by a logic as old as monarchy itself. Produce the heir, provide the image, ask for nothing. Diana, at 20, did not yet understand that those were the terms. She believed, as the broadcast wanted everyone to believe, that she had married a man who would love her. The man himself had already told the cameras otherwise. Here is the part the fairy tale required you to forget. She felt it almost at once, and the family she had married into could not have her feel it out loud. For a while the brood mare arithmetic appeared to work. The heir arrived, and a second son after him, and the succession was secure, which was, in the cold ledger of the institution, the entire point of the transaction. But the woman they had selected for her, assumed compliance, turned out to have a will. She would not be ornamental, and the first sign of the cost came in a form the family found unmentionable. The toll showed up in Diana's body. In the tapes she gave Andrew Morton, she described an eating disorder, bulimia, that arrived early in the marriage and stayed. She traced its beginning to a small, careless moment, the prince's hand on her waist, a remark about being a bit chubby. It is a detail that has been used for shock value many times, and it deserves better than that. It is not a scandal. It is evidence. It is the physical record of what it costs a 19-year-old to be inserted into a marriage as a function, rather than a person, to be adored by an entire planet while being quietly disregarded inside her own home. The institution had wanted a vessel. It had not budgeted for the vessel to suffer in a way the world could eventually see. And the world did see, because Diana made sure of it. This is the turn that the people who chose her never planned for. In June 1992, Andrew Morton published Diana, her true story. The palace denied any cooperation. The denial was a fiction. Diana was the source, her words carried out to Morton through an intermediary, and the book laid the marriage bare, the unhappiness, Camilla, the bulimia, the loneliness inside the gilded life. The girl who had been selected for her silence had found a way to speak, and she had aimed her voice at the one target that mattered, the version of events the institution wanted the public to believe. Within 6 months of the book, on the 9th of December 1992, the Prime Minister, John Major, stood up in the House of Commons and announced that the Prince and Princess of Wales were to separate. The wording was careful, no constitutional implications, an amicable arrangement. The reality was that the transaction had collapsed in public, and the public had taken Diana's side. What happened next has never been fully reconciled by the family that watched it. In November 1995, Diana sat in her room at Kensington Palace and gave the interview that finished any pretense of repair. To an audience estimated at 200 million, she said the line that condensed the whole arrangement into 11 words. There were 3 of us in this marriage, so it was a bit crowded. It was the first time she had named the third presence in public. It was also, in its way, the most precise thing anyone ever said about the institution that had chosen her. She had been told, on the day of her engagement, whatever in love means. 14 years later, she gave the answer the institution had spent her whole marriage trying to keep her from giving. Consider how completely this inverted the original plan. The woman had been selected for her silence. The entire premise of the checklist, young, unscandalous, suitable, was a premise of containment, a bride who would absorb the institution's needs and reflect back only what was wanted, who would smile through the photographs and never say the quiet part aloud. And instead, the institution had selected the single most magnetic public figure of her generation, a woman whom hundreds of millions of people did not merely respect but loved, and then handed her a grievance the entire world could understand. That is the miscalculation at the center of the whole story. The machine had assumed that compliance came bundled with the other qualities on the list, that a girl this suitable would naturally also be controllable. She was not. The adoration the family could not manufacture for itself attached to her instead, and once it had, every move the institution made against her landed as a move against the public's own beloved. They could strip her of standing inside the family. They could not strip her of the affection of the country. And so the war between Diana and the firm was a war the firm could not win cleanly, because the weapon Diana held, her voice, and the public's willingness to listen to it, was the one weapon the institution had no defense against. They had chosen her for her compliance and accidentally armed her with everything they most feared. And this is the title of the matter. Diana knew what the Queen Mother really was, not in the sense of a private confession. We do not have, and must not invent, the Queen Mother's own words about Diana, but the disposition is documented. Andrew Morton recorded that the Queen Mother was unfavorably disposed toward Diana and toward Diana's mother. A friend quoted in his book put it bluntly, that the Queen Mother drove a wedge between Diana and the rest of the family. The grandmother who had star-spotted the suitable girl had no warmth left for the woman that girl had become. The selection and the disposal ran through the same hands. You can hear it most clearly in what the household saw once the marriage was over. Colin Burgess, who served as the Queen Mother's equerry in the mid-1990s, described the aftermath in terms that need no embellishment. Once Diana split from Charles, he said, she was very much persona non grata, and he never again heard her name mentioned by, or in front of, the Queen Mum. Charles, Burgess noted, was far and away her favorite grandchild. The girl who had been useful was now simply unmentioned. There is a particular cruelty in that. And it is the institution's signature cruelty. Not rage, not a scene, just a name that quietly stops being spoken. The machine had selected her, used her to secure the succession, and then closed over the space where she had been as though she had never satisfied a single line of the checklist. The divorce was finalized on the 28th of August 1996, and here the institution exacted its last administrative price. The Queen removed the style of Her Royal Highness. Diana would remain Diana, Princess of Wales, the title that linked her to the heirs she had provided, but the 3 letters that signified she belonged inside the family were taken back. It was framed as procedure, granted on marriage, surrendered on divorce. But strip the procedure away, and the meaning is plain. The family had acquired her with a title and discharged her by removing one. She had been an HRH for 15 years. Now she was, in the institution's eyes, returned to the category of useful outsider. And this is the pattern worth naming, because it is the institution's method, and it does not change from one generation to the next. The firm rarely strikes, it subtracts. It does not denounce the inconvenient person. It simply withdraws the things that made them belong: the title, the access, the mention of their name at lunch, and lets the absence do the work. Look at how it was done here. There was no public condemnation of Diana, no formal verdict pronounced against her. There was a careful statement about constitutional implications, a quiet administrative adjustment to a style of address, and a grandmother in whose presence a name was no longer spoken. Each step, on its own, looked like nothing, like procedure, like protocol, like the ordinary tidying up after a marriage ends. Stacked together, they amounted to a person being erased in slow motion from the inside of the family that had selected her. That is the cruelty the channel's audience has come to recognize across all these stories. Not the loud kind, but the patient, well-mannered kind, conducted by people in pearls who would have been genuinely puzzled to hear themselves described as cruel at all. They were only doing their duty. The duty was to the institution. It had never been to her. Less than a year later, on the 31st of August 1997, in a tunnel in Paris, Diana was lost. She was 36. The grief that followed was not the grief of a nation for a princess of a fairy tale. It was something rawer and more accusing than that, and a great deal of the accusation pointed back at the institution that had selected her, used her, and then, by every documented account, declined to forgive her for becoming a person. We will not enter the lane of how she died, because how she died is not this story. This story is about how she was chosen and what choosing her revealed. The subject is the selection, and the two grandmothers. By the time Diana was lost, only one of them was still living. Lady Fermoy had died in July 1993, and there is one more documented sadness in the record, which is that by the time of her death she and Diana were reported to be no longer on speaking terms. Whatever warning she had once given her granddaughter, whatever regret she may have carried for her part in the world that produced the match, it went largely unspoken and unrecorded. The late regret attributed to her is exactly that, attributed, not certain, and we will not put words in a dead woman's mouth. The Queen Mother outlived Diana by nearly 5 years, dying in 2002 at the age of 101, the name of her grandson's first wife, by then a thing not said aloud in her presence. Two old women who had occupied the most intimate room in the most powerful family in the country. One had seen the girl and approved her. One had warned the girl and lost her. Neither lived to answer for what the selection had set in motion, and neither, it seems, was ever asked to. That is the arithmetic, and the arithmetic is the horror, not a villain twirling a mustache, a checklist, a friendship, a suitable girl who fit the specification, and an institution that valued the specification over the human being who satisfied it, right up until the human being became inconvenient, at which point her name simply stopped being spoken. They chose her the way you choose a vessel, for her youth, her blood, her blamelessness, and her assumed willingness to be exactly what she was told to be. Two old women in pearls, best friends for half a century, guided a teenage girl toward an altar and a man who loved someone else and told themselves it was duty. But Diana was not a vessel. She was a person with a heart that wouldn't behave and a voice the whole world wanted to hear. And the moment she became one, the machine that had selected her so carefully turned on her completely. The fairy tale was always a recruitment poster. The firm needed an heir and found a girl, used her up and let her go, and the people who picked her never had to answer for it. Diana knew what they really were. By the time she said it out loud, it was already too late.